Nearly 200 executives, including the leaders of Apple, Pepsi, and Walmart, tried this past week on Monday to redefine the role of business in society and how companies are perceived by an increasingly skeptical public. What did they do? They held a business roundtable, which they hold annually. It's a lobbying group of some of the most powerful firms in the country. And in that statement that they released, they said, shareholder value will no longer be held up to the standard it has. We are going to no longer prioritize profits. We are no longer going to prioritize maximizing shareholder value. And we are instead going to focus on community, our employees, and the other businesses that we work with along the way. Now, you might want to believe that, you might not want to believe that, but let me just get right into it. Breaking with decades of long-held corporate orthodoxy, the Business Roundtable issued a statement on the purpose of a corporation, arguing that companies should no longer advance the interests of the shareholder. Instead, the group said they must also invest in their employees, protect the environment, and deal fairly and ethically with their suppliers. Now, this goes against what they had originally said, which in its own articulation of the theory, specifically Milton Friedman's theory that greed is good and that the only social responsibility that a corporation has is to maximize its profits and everything else will be great. And its own articulation of that theory in the official doctrine in 1997 was that the paramount duty of management and boards of directors is to the corporation's shareholders. Each version of its principles published over the last 20 years has stated that corporations exist principally to serve their shareholders. So they're going back on this basically. What do you think about that, Dan? How do you feel? Is change coming?
I don't think so. I think this game. I wouldn't put too much trust in a statement like that. I feel like these companies are kind of feeling the pressure, not only from the left with Sanders and Warren, but also from the right recently, with like this new national conservatism movement popping up, which doesn't even pretend to care about free markets because it's failed so many people. I think this is like maybe just like buying time. I don't think that these companies will do anything that will make them less profitable or less competitive unless they're forced to do so.
Yeah. Of course, and I think that's precisely what they're terrified by. If you watch CNBC or if you watch any of these like business-centered, if you watch any of the business-centered news coverage, one really interesting thing I found is that they never mention Bernie Sanders. They only talk about Elizabeth Warren. I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but even when they're talking about Elizabeth Warren, they talk about her in such fearful terms, and they are terrified of another specific thing that they bring up all the time, which is 50% of millennials no longer favor capitalism over socialism, and they're like, how do we change this? How do we change this reality? We're freaking out. And I think finally, because of social media and because of just genuinely how terrible the economic situation has gotten to, people are finally starting to realize that this is a gigantic problem and corporations are at the very least paying lip service to the idea. I don't think this is real change. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's gonna, real change is never gonna come from the top down. Real change is never gonna come unless we drastically change the profit motive and drastically change the outlook and how much power the workforce has, obviously. But as Darren Walker, a Pepsi board member, said, the ideology of shareholder primacy has contributed to the economic inequality we see today in America. The Chicago School of Economics is so embedded in the psyche of investors and legal theory and the CEO mindset, overcoming that won't be easy. Like they're throwing their godfather, and the Chicago School of Economics that has been like the main theory going forward since the 80s and 90s that focused on like corporate raiders and greed is good and cut back on all of these different things, including like philanthropy budgets in corporations and their service to their communities. They're trying to change that now, but I don't think it's going to be real change unless it's change brought about by either a regulatory force, as you mentioned, or potentially by the workers themselves in an effort to democratize the workforce. Dan, not to throw you on the spot here, but one thing that I wanted to ask you specifically is, I mean, you're a big history buff, right? You love history. You cover a lot of things from a historical perspective, and I wanted to ask you, I mean, how has this worked in the past? Hasn't big businesses almost always sided with fascism? If I'm mistaken, isn't, and I'm comparing us to like 1932, I would say, maybe like 1934, 1935. Like that's the era I'm looking towards now. Didn't big businesses and even liberals originally assume that fascism was just a more muscular way to enforce the capitalist dynamic at a time when the other side, which was Marxism or like labor organizing, at a time when that was considered to be much more threatening to the established status quo?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I would agree to that. Maybe I wouldn't say like we're at the point of, or America is at the point of 1932, but despite like Adolf Hitler, for instance, not having many big industrialists under his wing during his rise, except for the Thyssen Company, as you said, when the rubber meets the road, an ideology that is as destructive as fascism is still preferable to something like socialism or any kind of ideology that expropriates the wealth, than an ideology which leaves it in the hand of the big industrialists. So yeah, that's basically the reason why so many conservatives and the center party, etc., preferred like fascism over the alternative, which was communism at the time.
Yeah, yeah, and that is something that I'm genuinely fearful of. Outside of, I mean, look, I don't care about the ideological reasons for why we should be pushing for more labor organizing or whatever. I look at it completely from a pragmatic perspective. I think that any sort of profit-centered business is obviously not going to have the same kind of longevity that a business that centers around its workers will have, or demonstrably has had, if you look at successful cooperative corporations like the Mondragon Corporation. But my focus is like the way that we have concentrated wealth and power in this country and under the current system, the current economic organization, has gotten to a level that has fostered undeniable economic inequality, so much so that even the members at the top, the main beneficiaries of the structure, are forced to identify this issue and are forced to, at the very least, pay lip service to it. Now, I'm not alone in being skeptical about this. Bernie Sanders also said, I don't believe what they're saying for a moment. If they were sincere, they would talk about raising the minimum wage in this country to a living wage, the need for the rich and powerful to pay their fair share of taxes. Now, I 100% agree with that sentiment, because one of the things that they did not mention is CEO compensation, or the compensation structure that exclusively centers around exclusively centers around the maximization of shareholder value, the fiduciary responsibility, the fact that this is like embedded into our legal structure, even that this is the main priority, and it's usually often used as a cop-out. Whenever a corporation or whenever a CEO is held responsible for the actions of their corporation, they'll always say, hey, I did this for my shareholders. I had to maximize shareholder value. And but for some reason, the Business Roundtable, which is comprised of some of the most powerful CEOs, are not taking any legal steps, or are not taking any steps to pressure the government to potentially write out new rules and regulations to hold corporations accountable for these sorts of actions, especially actions that harm the public, or decisions that they make that actively harm the planet, for example. Anyway, but let's move on, unless you have any additional thoughts on this, to the second thing, which is a more positive story.
I mean, like, even if something comes to fruition on that front, like, I don't know, more maternity leave or benefits for employees, this is never going to be done out of like CEOs saying, well, let's be a bit more humanitarian. But these are just things to get a leg up on their competitors, to get more skilled workers to be more competitive. So yeah, it's always going to be done within that framework and never out of like humanitarian impulses.
Yeah, well, obviously, if look, this is something I ask libertarians all the time, which is like, look, if you were so magnanimous, if you wanted to help the people out of the kindness of your heart, then why aren't you redistributing profits in a more equitable fashion? Why are you extracting surplus value from the labor of your workers and not necessarily allowing them to have a say in the way that profit gets distributed, whether it be marketing budgets or whatever? Or if you genuinely cared, if philanthropy, individual philanthropy, were to solve all these problems, well, we currently have a lot of problems. Where is the philanthropy? Where, like, who's stopping these 501c3s from acting in this way to solve income inequality, or to solve global poverty, or to solve food insecurity, even in a country like America where we have an abundance of food, right? Globally, when we have an abundance of food production and food supply, but there are still 8 million people, give or take, dying every year of famine-related diseases. So obviously, this sort of philanthropic endeavors, don't actually work. We need systemic change, wide sweeping systemic changes.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.